Welcome to this lecture series on the English settlement of the New World. We're going to start off by looking at the Tudors. Now, the English are going to get a late start to the New World as well, but it's going to be driven more by internal affairs and no external pressures, no wars or anything like that. And it's going to have to do with the rise of the Tudors. The Tudors are probably one of the best known and one of the more shorter dynasties in English history. I mean, you're only talking about 5 monarchs across 3 generations. But it all begins in 1485. In 1485, Henry becomes Henry VII of England, the first Tudor king. And he becomes that because he wins on August 22nd the Battle of Bosworth. In that battle, he's going to defeat Richard III, right? This is going to effectively end what's been called historically the War of the Roses, and it's going to establish the House of Tudor in there. Now, Henry VII is going to rule England until his death in 1509. Of course, 1492, we have this new continent discovered. Does he show some interest in it? Well, yeah, initially he does. Matter of fact, in 1497, just 5 years later, he'll send John Cabot to sail to the north coast of North America. And Cabot will return and, same kind of thing, find a passage to China. And he'll return having not found a passage to China, but he'll report about a tremendous amount of codfish off the shores of New England, which is going to begin attracting, like the fur trade did for the French, it's going to begin attracting British fishermen out to the waters off of North America. So in 1509, when Henry VII dies, the crown passes to his son, Henry, and he becomes Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII is probably the most famous of the English kings, and he wasn't supposed to be king at all. The crown was supposed to pass on to the oldest brother, who was a boy named Arthur, right? But Arthur had died before Henry VII passed away, and so that means Henry VIII, who was the second son, becomes king. It's always very important in these monarchies to have multiple sons. You want an heir and a spare, right? Because Henry VIII definitely gets this. He's the spare, okay? Now, Henry VIII is actually a very staunch Catholic. Matter of fact, in the British Museum, they still have his copy of the Bible, which he has he's annotated and stuff, taking notes in his observations from what he saw from studying the Bible. So much so, in fact, that in 1521, on October 17th, Pope Leo X is going to declare him fidei defensor, right, the defender of the faith, right? Now, he marries Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon was Arthur's wife, his older brother. Now, that should be a no-no. But what the argument that Henry VIII makes to the Pope is that, well, yes, Arthur and Catherine had gotten married. This is a political marriage, obviously, Aragon, Spain, right? Another Catholic nation. But they didn't consummate their marriage, so it wasn't official, and so I can take her as my bride. We have this political marriage, and so he is married to Catherine for the next 23 years. Now, her job as queen, she really only has one function: make sons, right? An heir and a spare. So, they get married. She becomes pregnant. She has a daughter. They name her Mary, and then they proceed to, try again. She goes through a series of miscarriages and stillbirths and things like that, but she doesn't produce the son, and Henry VIII becomes really, really agitated over this. He really becomes nervous. He needs to have that heir. At the same time, he's become smitten with one of the ladies-in-waiting in his court, right? One of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting. So, he decides that he wants to try and get an annulment. He can't get a divorce, but he perhaps can get an annulment. Okay? So, in 1529, he seeks an annulment from Catherine, right? He petitions the Pope, and he basically says, you know what, upon further reflection, we believe that she did actually consummate with Arthur, which means our marriage is invalid, right? And I should be allowed to get an annulment, okay? Pope Clement VII, who's the Pope at this time, is actually put in a really difficult spot, right? Because, first of all, this is the fidei defensor, right? Asking for an annulment. He's got a lot of reasons to give it to this guy. But at the same time, it's Catherine of Aragon, right? The Spanish kingdom. And she is a relative of the Habsburgs, right? Matter of fact, her nephew is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who happens to control the kingdom of Naples just south of the Papal State. So if he grants this annulment, he's basically going to be kicking Catherine of Aragon to the curb, making Mary a bastard, and possibly ticking off a very powerful neighbor to the south. So he decides, I'm not going to do it. I refuse to grant the annulment. I'm afraid you're just stuck with her. But Henry is not going to be stopped there. He is just going to formulate a new plan to get what he wants. Henry VIII is going to turn to a new Christian religion that's gaining strength in Central Europe at this time, Protestantism. Protestantism traces its origins to a man named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a priest in Wittenberg, Germany, right? But he'd become very disenchanted with the Catholic Church. And specifically, one of the things that really bothered him was the ability to purchase indulgences. See, according to church doctrine, that when you died, because nobody is absolutely sin-free, you would go to purgatory for a little while, right? Not the ski resort in Colorado, a different one, right? You go to purgatory where you work off your time for your sins. But you could reduce that time if you get indulgences. And the church at this point was pretty much selling them. Matter of fact, there were actually people that would go town to town, like door-to-door salesmen, selling indulgences, right? Now, the way this mentally works out is this. The way you earn indulgences is that you do good deeds, like, say, help the poor. But, ain't nobody got time for that, so what do? Well, I could just give money to the poor, and they can help themselves. How do I know if they're going to use that money properly? So if I give money to the church is responsible for helping the poor, then by proxy, I am helping the poor, therefore, indulgences. See, it's a really short leap then from the church actually soliciting these. Martin Luther has a real issue with this. And so in 1517, he is going to nail 95 theses onto the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, criticizing the church for indulgences and a bunch of other things. In 1520, he'll be excommunicated, but you'll start seeing a growth of different Protestant religions, right? And there's a whole bunch of different ones of them, right? So Henry decides to use that to break from the church. He launches what's called the English Reformation, right? And from that, he creates the Church of England, or Anglicanism. Now, the thing about Anglicanism that you have to realize is that while he gets rid of the papal authority, he says, I was chosen, I'm a king, and I'm king because God made me king, therefore I have the same authority as the Pope, right? It's called the royal supremacy, okay? While he does that, and he switches to the Protestant faith, at least in word, not in sight, right? He still loves all the trappings of Catholicism. So when you take a look at the Anglican religion, it sounds Protestant, but it looks Catholic. So with the establishment of the Anglican Church, now Henry VIII can divorce Catherine of Aragon. And he does, and she goes into exile with her daughter Mary to Spain, right? He then marries that lady-in-waiting that he'd been pining for, Anne Boleyn. She gets pregnant. Yay. She has a daughter. Oh, right, they name her Elizabeth. Okay. She then has a series of miscarriages, and you see the same pattern start to develop, but she gets caught up in some of the court intrigues that leaves her being accused of conspiring against the king and even possibly having sex with her brother, and she's put on a weight loss program. She'll lose 15 pounds from about here up, right? So she's executed, and he marries his third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour produces a son, Edward, very sickly, and the birth itself was really hard on Jane Seymour. She'll die 2 weeks later, okay? Wife number 4 will be similar to Catherine of Aragon, a political marriage, Anne of Cleves, but it's only going to last a few days because it was all done through correspondence, and when Anne of Cleves arrived apparently in Henry VIII's opinion, she was incredibly ugly, and both visually and spiritually. She was kind of mean-spirited, right? So he had that marriage annulled. Wife number 5 was Catherine Howard, and she kind of went the same route of Anne Boleyn. She got caught up in some of the intrigues, got accused of treason and adultery, and also was put on a weight loss program, if you know what I mean. And then the final wife was Catherine of Parr. Catherine Parr, who was in the later stages of his life, was really just kind of like the placeholder while he finally dies. Now, in 1547, he passes away, and the crown passes on to these three children, right? The first in line, of course, is Edward. He's the son. He's the youngest, but he's the son. The male heir gets the crown first, right? Until Elizabeth II actually will get rid of that practice, right? So he becomes Edward VI, and he's going to reign, but he's going to reign for a short time, from 1547 to 1553. He's only 9 when he becomes king, right? And he's going to be 15 when he dies. That's why the portraiture is so young, right? But he's a dedicated Anglican, and he's going to begin aggressively trying to eradicate Catholicism from England. So now you have this religious turmoil in there. We're going to get rid of all the Catholics, okay? But like I said, 6 years later, he's dead. Now who's going to be king? Well, it's going to be a queen. Mary, Catherine's daughter, is now going to ascend to the throne. Now remember, she was raised by Catherine of Aragon. She was raised Catholic. She's going to try and reverse everything back, right? She'll take the crown in 1553, and she will try to reestablish Catholicism in England. And she'll begin persecuting Anglicans. A matter of fact, she'll start putting Anglican priests to death, accusing them of heresy. And she'll execute somewhere around 300 of them. She'll get a nickname as a result of this. They'll call her Bloody Mary, right? But again, her reign will be short-lived. It's only 5 years, 1553, and then in 1558 she dies, right? Then we'll have Elizabeth I ascend to the throne, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And she'll reign until her death in 1603. She will switch England back to Protestantism again, this time for good.